With my eyes set on a loving God, showing us landmarks and signposts of history for the last 2,000 years and into the end times, I set out to explore the three main interpretations of prophecy. The first being preterism. Preterism generally coincides with the historical critical method that is taught at secular institutions. The historical critical method's ultimate goal is to remove anything supernatural and reduce the text to just another story that we all know was written in a certain culture in a certain era at a certain time. All prophecy would thus have been recorded after the fact and not before the events occurred, a presupposition that removes supernatural prophecy altogether. To this end, the book of Daniel, which shows the rise and fall of at least four empires in Daniel 2 and 7, is posited to be written as late as possible, about 168 BC, because there is no explicit mention of the Roman Empire. Rome didn't make its presence felt in the Middle East until about 161 BC, when the envoys of Judas Maccabeus concluded a treaty of friendship with the Roman Senate. One of the immediate shortcomings of this method is that it can't explain how Daniel, with additions, made it into the Septuagint, or how numerous copies came to be found with the Dead Sea Scrolls, both of which occurred about the same time. The supposed writer of Daniel was not Daniel as described in the book, but a person experiencing the tyranny of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who dedicated the Temple Mount to Zeus and sacrificed swine on the altar, enraging the Jews and causing a revolt and the rise of the Maccabean dynasty. The writer also had messianic expectations on the immediate horizon, but for the preterist method, that's where Daniel starts to fall apart, because the prophecies are missing many details like the Roman Empire, and many details don't line up with reality. The apocryphal books of 1 and 2 Maccabees were written at this time about these events, and they kind of quote Daniel 8 and 9, but they failed to make it into the Jewish canon. Other books appear to be older, such as 1 Enoch, but it also failed to make it into the Jewish canon. But according to preterism, Daniel somehow did. Preterism overlooks these inconsistencies and suggests that Jesus did fill the writer's messianic expectation. Preterism has to make an artificial distinction between the Medes and the Persians and the Achaemenid Empire in order to shorten timelines in Daniel so that generally everything is accomplished before Rome shows up. Wikipedia confirms the Persians conquered the Medes prior to the fall of Babylon. The Median Empire was contemporary to Babylon, it did not follow it. Later, the Diadochi had quickly united into two kingdoms after Alexander the Great's demise. After the northern Seleucid Syriac kingdom was devastated by the Parthian Empire, it was absorbed by Rome in 63 BC, and the southern Ptolemaic Egypt was absorbed by 30 BC. Thus Jesus came after the Diadochi during the Roman kingdom, and the resulting Christianity did not end the Diadochi kingdoms, and definitely did not end any of the previous kingdoms as suggested by the rock shattering the statue in Daniel 2. So the rock could not be the first coming of Christ. It appears that certain details across Daniel 2, 7, 8, and 9, while lining up in the text, are overlooked by preterist interpreters. Preterism has another discrepancy. 605 is when Nebuchadnezzar first invaded Judah. This hardly seems like the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem of Daniel 9. Also, preterism places the 7 and 62 in parallel. 7 and 62 in parallel is still only 62 weeks. Daniel 9:24 explicitly states 70 weeks are determined. Double counting 7 weeks doesn't seem to be a correct way of interpreting it. One of the main tenets of preterism is that the Gospels seem to have certain indications that Jesus' second coming would be about the same time that Jerusalem was destroyed. The Olivet Discourse in Mark 13, Matthew 24, and Luke 21 being a primary example. They go to great lengths to redefine the word parousia in Greek. Preterists believe the vast majority of Revelation refers to the first Roman-Jewish war in the 60s and ultimately to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Thus, preterism suggests Revelation had to be written before 70 AD because it seems to have references to a temple but no references to a destroyed temple, which contradicts some of the early church fathers who stated that Revelation was written about 100 AD. If it was written in 100 AD, then all the events in 60 AD would necessarily be excluded. Thus, preterism postulates that Jesus' second coming occurred in 70 AD, at least spiritually, which, if true, seems to be missed by all the early church fathers, making it a secret coming, which Scripture explicitly warns about in the Olivet Discourse. Justin Martyr, an early 2nd century leader, wrote, Two advents of Christ had been announced. The one in which he is set forth as suffering, inglorious, dishonored, and crucified, but the other in which he shall come from heaven with glory, when the man of apostasy who speaks strange things against the Most High shall venture to do unlawful deeds on the earth against us the Christians. The rest of the prophecy shall be fulfilled at his second coming. So according to Justin Martyr, Christ's second coming hadn't come by the 2nd century and still appeared to be in the future. Partial preterism extends certain parts of Revelation to the fall of Rome in 476 AD, but no further. Looking at the history of the preterist interpretation, it appears as one of the earliest attacks on Christianity came from a philosopher named Porphyry in about 300 AD that stated that all of Daniel was actually about Antiochus Epiphanes. Specifically, he started with Daniel 8, which various interpreters had already wondered if it was about Antiochus, which is also the interpretation of the apocryphal books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Porphyry basically set up the framework for preterism to inherit. Jerome quotes Porphyry as stating, "Daniel did not predict so much future events as he narrated past ones. Finally, what he had told up to Antiochus contained true history. If anything was guessed beyond that point, it was false, for he had not known the future." Some preterists also point to Eusebius of Caesarea, who expounded upon the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem shortly after Porphyry, but he doesn't appear to tie it into any sort of revelation. The next steps for this methodology occurred in the Counter-Reformation, when the Jesuit Louis de Alcazar created a systematic method of interpretation based upon Porphyry's attack. This was to deflect and derail the Protestant Reformation in Europe, suggesting that the Antichrist in Daniel was Antiochus Epiphanes and the Antichrist in Revelation was Nero. If Nero was the Antichrist, it would have meant something to the apostles and early Christians, but we don't see any of the earliest church fathers reference Nero as the Antichrist, although there are some reference in the pseudepigrapha that seem to suggest Nero may come back as the Antichrist, the Nero Revividus legend. Augustine, 350 years later after Christ, was the first one to link Nero with the mystery of iniquity. Hugo de Groot was the first Protestant to adopt preterism. Again, my view of a loving God is that he provides information before we need it, not 300 or more years after. Also in 1585, as part of the Counter-Reformation, another Jesuit, Francisco Ribera, developed futurism based upon many of the early church fathers perceiving the Antichrist to be in the future. While many of the early church fathers did suggest certain prophecies were yet in the future, many expositors prior to and during the Reformation had some pretty valid interpretations of prophecy based upon the historicist approach. Interpretations that the Catholic Church was trying to deflect. In the early 1900s, the Scofield Reference Bible promoted futurism within Protestant circles. One of the main tenets is that we are still looking for a spiritual successor to the Roman Empire. Papal Rome wasn't it. Thus, futurism creates a gap in many of the prophecies by suggesting that events are still in the future. The strangest gap is in the reinterpreted 70 weeks prophecy, which early church fathers used to point to Christ. Futurism alters this to be about the Antichrist and it suggests that the last week is still in the future. What good is it to count to 69 except that 70 is immediately next? Both preterism and futurism don't provide any waypoints for a Christian to follow to the end times, and thus falls short of any interpretation I'm looking for. One of the largest problems I have with these two methodologies is that they claim no one has gotten it right for the first 1500 or so years of Christianity. It was still my opinion that a loving God would give a timeline for people to follow. Even if we couldn't agree on the exact fulfillments, we could see biblical prophecies as a timeline slowly being fulfilled, which is what the early church interpretation was. Biblical debate is often vital to eventually figuring out the correct biblical answer. Had the Reformers been preterist or futurist, the Protestant Reformation would never have happened. It was their belief in continual prophetic fulfillment that led to the path they chose.